here on Live Now from Fox. And there's going to be a lot of aspects that we're going to get into. But maybe first and foremost, what's the one aspect, one component that you're looking into when it comes to the former president being on the stand in this civil fraud trial there in New York?
Well, Andy, we're seeing American history this week with a former president taking the stand. Obviously, this is just a civil case, but this is a preview of what is going to transpire in the criminal case as well. Donald Trump is a fighter. He's going to continue to do so on the witness stand. There was a brief moment last week where he had to take the stand and explain some of his social media posts, and it got a little contentious, a little feisty. So I expect more of the same. It's going to be must-see TV in that New York court as early as tomorrow.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. No cameras allowed inside, but that doesn't mean we're not going to learn soon kind of what happens inside. And of course, you mentioned this is just a civil trial, not necessarily a criminal trial. Just give me a breakdown of maybe how those are different in terms of when somebody is on the stand.
Well, Andy, obviously the biggest difference is no one's going to jail, but it still could have a significant effect for Donald Trump and the Trump organization. He's looking at a fine of potentially hundreds of millions of dollars, and more importantly, he may lose his business license and the ability to maintain his massive real estate empire in New York. Obviously, because it's a civil case, it's a lower standard, and obviously we don't have a jury here, but we're dealing with just preponderance of the evidence. The judge has already ruled that some of those financial statements were fraudulent, but there are claims that remain and that require knowledge and intent. There's some conspiracy and fraud claims. So it's going to be interesting to see, does Trump really try to defend these valuations, or does he point the finger at his accountants like his sons did last week?
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting because, of course, maybe not yes and no answers coming from the former president. That's not usually his style. Maybe how does that benefit maybe the defense? Maybe how does that benefit everybody? Just give me a breakdown of that, because he's not going to be short in his words. What could that maybe lead to?
Well, it could lead to problems in the legal case, but it may benefit him politically. Every time Trump gets charged or he ends up with some legal problem, he gets a boost in the polls. So he's not necessarily just looking at the audience in that courtroom, but he's looking at potential voters who are going to have to decide between him and likely President Joe Biden a year from now. So I expect, like you said, for him to come out swinging, to be very aggressive, for him to defend his brand, which is really under attack here. So it's not going to be, dodging and bobbing and weaving like maybe some of the other witnesses in this case.
Yeah, and the brand is going to be a big component of what we're talking about. Of course, the persona of the former president, real estate tycoon there in New York. This could bar him from doing business in New York. But there was also talk about the Forbes list. Maybe how, as a former federal prosecutor, would you go about that component? Would you press him on that Forbes list? Because maybe the ego part would be something you want to get at. Would that be something that we'll see in this as he takes the stand?
If you're with the New York AG's office, you have to be chomping at the bit to cross-examine Donald Trump. I think the examination should go according to script. Obviously, Trump has very good lawyers and they have a good plan in this case, but it's really that cross-examination. And we've seen how Donald Trump has been when he's poked and prodded in just interviews with the press, but this is going to be more aggressive. I expect it to be a lot more contentious. And for Donald Trump, he really cares about being a good businessman, right? That's something that a lot of voters also care about. So if it's all smoke and mirrors and it's fraud, that's something that's going to hurt Donald Trump's ego, but also the story that he's telling potential voters.
Yeah, and that's the part of it is potential voters, but also inside of the courtroom, of course, no jury there. The judge is going to be deciding this as well. And we've also heard the former president take shots at the judge just outside of those court halls. Maybe how much does he have to be careful when he's on the stand about some of these things that he says, especially with the judge sitting basically next to him?
Well, the traditional rules and conventional wisdom just don't seem to apply to Donald Trump. Most of us would be hesitant to attack the decision maker in the case, but Trump has had no hesitation to do so, going after the judge, going after the judge's clerk, even though the judge is going to be the one who's deciding this case and potentially alienating him. But, I think Trump is looking past this particular judge. He's looking at the Court of Appeal. He's trying to create a record. He's trying to protect himself and obviously get that Republican nomination there in March. So I don't expect him to pull any punches, despite his lawyers probably advising him to do so.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. It must be certainly an interesting task, to say the least, when you're a lawyer for the former president, because what he says is kind of what he says, and you don't really have a ton of restraint on that as well. Let's get into what his sons Eric Jr. and Don also said. John Jr., and Eric last week. Maybe what did we make of them taking the stand? Because, of course, we saw some heated moments as well, some tense moments we heard about in the court. Maybe what did we make of what we saw last week with those two people?
Well, Don Jr. and Eric really stuck to the script, and they said, listen, we're not accountants. We relied on the family CPAs when it came to these valuations. So they really tried to distance themselves from that. Of course, Don Jr. signed off on them, and he was the trustee of the family trust while Donald Trump was president. But, they said, listen, we're not accountants. We're not CPAs. We relied on the experts. That may have been good for them individually, but it wasn't a particularly good defense in the case. And this is why. Someone needs to get up and they need to justify these valuations, say they weren't inflated, they weren't overvalued, and this is why. So I fully expect Donald Trump to do that, to try to defend himself and the organization. That's going to be something that's going to be very different from his son's testimony last week.
Yeah, and that's kind of interesting as well, just the different dynamic in those individuals, of course, the former president versus his sons, and of course, kind of throwing the blame around as well. Do you expect maybe that to be different, what his sons did versus what he might say on the stand?
I don't think Trump can take the same approach that his son did if he has any chance of winning this case. Look, and he might not care. He might just want to push it on his accountants, but someone needs to really say, listen, I'm responsible here, because at the end of the day, this is a civil case. That knowledge and intent is not required for all the claims. So, for instance, in the election fraud case, Trump might say, I was relying on the advice of my lawyers, and that's why I did what I did, because the prosecution there has to get inside Trump's mind, prove that knowledge, prove that intent. That's not required here. Trump is responsible for the actions of his organization and the principals and the agents and the course and scope of their employment. So someone needs to step up. Someone needs to defend, really in granular terms, why the square footage was inflated, why certain numbers that were provided to the lenders were misleading, because that's what the judge ruled here. So I expect Donald Trump to be the witness to do so.
Yeah, and it will be just about the facts and figures, not necessarily if this happened or didn't happen, because they already ruled on that. Now moving on to Ivanka, of course, she's going to testify potentially after the former president. Just give me timing of things based on Don Jr., Eric, the former president, now Ivanka. Does that have any meaning to it at all?
I think it's mostly based on their schedules. Obviously, Ivanka wanted nothing to do with this case. Her lawyers were able to successfully get the claims against her dismissed, so she's not a party, but she's still a witness. Now, they filed and they appealed to try to prevent her from having to testify, saying she lives in Florida, she has kids to watch after, and the judges and the appellate court basically ruled against her. So she's going to come in probably Wednesday as a witness. Donald Trump may testify again tomorrow. But really, I think it's based on their schedules more than anything, because this is the defense case, so they can kind of put their witnesses in whatever order they deem best, and that's what's happening here.
I gotcha. That makes total sense. Of course, we saw that appeal get denied there as well, and likely to take the stand, like you said, on Wednesday. And in terms of maybe playing the blame game like Eric and Don Jr. did, will it be the same strategy for Ivanka? What can she say that might be different, and maybe how will her role in this organization kind of impact everything that's going on here?
I think Ivanka will do the same. Of all the children, she was the least involved, So you have Don Jr., who at least is, signing and attesting to the numbers. Eric, famously said, he's the operations guy. He's the one who's on the ground pouring the concrete. But really, Ivanka is even further removed than both of them. So I don't think she's going to be wrapped up in this. I think she's going to say, listen, this wasn't something I handled. You got to talk to the folks that were directly involved. And I expect most of her testimony to be about that. And frankly, that's why the claims against her were dismissed.
Yeah, correct. And of course, the focus this week, of course, Ivanka coming up, but the former president, and certainly the headliner there on the stand. Just as terms of $250 million and what it means in Mar-a-Lago, what happens in New York, there's a lot of discussion about Mona Lisa properties, and these values, the way they are, might be inflated just based on the Trump name. Maybe how will he play that card, the Mona Lisa factor, the factor that these prices are what they're sold for if someone wants to buy them based on the fact that they're property of the former president. Will that be a factor this week?
I think so. And frankly, I think that's a good argument. I mean, this is Donald Trump. He is one of the most recognized people in the world, business world and political world. You know, if you or I had the same property, it probably wouldn't appraise for or be valued as much because we don't have that it factor that the former president does. So he's going to need to get up there and explain why he thinks the properties were worth a lot more than some of these appraisers, because this is the art, right? Maybe the art of the deal and not necessarily a science. So I think we're going to hear a lot about the Trump brand and why his mere presence adds significant value to these properties.
Yeah, it's a very subjective potential argument there to look at some of these properties as well. Just in terms of what we know, former President Trump going to testify there the next coming days. Ivanka, maybe what does the timeline look for this civil fraud trial kind of go out? Can you kind of give us a picture of what it may look like over the next few weeks or something, and maybe how soon can we see a decision?
We may see a decision as soon as, next week. I mean, it's really going to take because really it's the judge, right? So Judge Engoron needs to prepare a written decision because obviously we know whatever decision there is going to go up on appeal to the New York Court of Appeals. But, the state, they're already in the money. They've already proven some of those claims. And, there's been lengthy opinions on that. There's been partial summary judgment granted. So there's going to be findings of fact and conclusions of law in that order. And there's going to be a damages award. And I also expect that part of that award is going to be that the Trump organization is going to lose their business license. So frankly, it's going to be as soon as the judge can get that written order prepared, but it really should be a matter of days, if not weeks at the max.
Yeah, and it was going to be interesting kind of to see how maybe this might impact the other trials that could potentially be coming up for the former president. But that was maybe some great insight inside of the courtroom. But we have seen time and time again when they come into the courtroom, when they take breaks, when they go to lunch, we've seen this scene outside of the courtroom, the former president there kind of holding court with all the media members as well. We're probably going to see that over the next few days during this, obviously Monday, and then Wednesday is election day. They won't be there in the courtroom. But of course, what do we expect from the former president in terms of that? Maybe how does that, his vocalization of what he sees inside the courtroom, how could that have an impact on what's going on? Because we've seen gag orders, we've seen fines put in place. Maybe are we expecting a similar kind of front from the former president out there? And maybe how will that impact this civil fraud trial?
I think there's two issues. First, regardless of what you think about Donald Trump, he is a master of the media. Even the day he had to famously make that appearance in Atlanta and surrender, I mean, he gave a press conference and his polling numbers went up with that mugshot. So I fully expect the same to happen here, both before he testifies and certainly after. Donald Trump will address the media, and I think he'll be able to spin it in a way that both appeals to his base and potentially undecided voters as well. But you brought up a great point about the gag order. And obviously we're dealing with gag orders in multiple jurisdictions. But really what I see with respect to these gag orders and the judges who have implemented them, they're frankly all bark, no bite. Fines of $5,000 or $10,000 for someone like Donald Trump, I mean, that's not even a slap on the wrist. I mean, that's walking around money for him. So unless you're going to enforce the gag order in a meaningful way, and meaningful, that would be contempt, doesn't really have a whole lot of teeth there. So the question is a judge willing to take the unprecedented step of revoking Donald Trump's bond, ordering him on house arrest, or even jailing him? Again, not something I'm suggesting, but small fines of thousands or tens of thousands of dollars aren't going to move the needle with respect to Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's a good point when you're talking about $250 million there in those fines, but now we're just talking about $5,000 or $10,000. That is a very small amount compared to what we're talking about inside the courtroom. And you also talked about the gag orders and the contempt orders potentially. they're just kind of on the table, maybe not being put in place. But with him now sitting next to the judge, testifying there, if he does say something about the judge, will the judge maybe be more inclined to do it, seeing as maybe he's just not a member inside the courtroom? He's actually a person on the stand this time.
Well, potentially, but we saw the judge listen to Donald Trump's testimony, essentially call him a liar and not credible, and still fine him $10,000. And this was something that was a direct violation of his order, criticism of his law clerk. So again, I understand, judges are ordinary people, and taking the unprecedented step of, potentially locking up Donald Trump. I mean, that's something that I think anyone would be hesitant to do so, may cause civil unrest. I mean, there's all sorts of problems, but, frankly, I mean, these gag orders, I fully expect Donald Trump to continue to push the limits because no one's really imposing any consequences for his failure to adhere to them.
Yeah, we'll see if the consequences come down from this civil fraud trial. Neama Rahmani, former federal prosecutor, thanks for joining us. I want to give you the final word. Any parting thoughts, any more notes you want to make before I let you go about the upcoming testimony from the former president?
Well, I think this case is going to be historic, but really we should mark our calendars for March 2024. I think that DC criminal case where we talked about, this may being the main event, but it may be the undercard for really the biggest trial in American history. And I don't think that DC Judge Tanya Chutkan is going to move that date. So we're marching towards the inevitable criminal trial, the United States versus Donald Trump.
Yeah, it's going to be a wild one to see for sure. Of course, we're going to keep our eyes on the courtroom in New York City tomorrow for all the latest developments. Thank you again for joining us, providing so much great insight and perspective here on Live Now from Fox.
Thanks for having me, as always.
All right, thank you again. All right, I'm Andy Mack here on Live Now from Fox. We're going to continue on covering that story. Of course, expected to take the stand and testify in this civil fraud trial tomorrow. Of course, he is still very much atop the Republican